Welcome to this PowerPoint on the 20th century in American history. What we're going to do is take a look here at what's happened in the US history since the time period after the Civil War. And really, once we get past the Civil War, so much changes in who we are and our identity. We like to look back at the beginnings of American history, the constitutional period, the Civil War period, but in so many ways, we really are very different post the Civil War. And so when we look at this issue of American identity that we're looking at, we really have to ask, what is unique about the 20th century and what are some of the common patterns that we see stretching back to the past? So in order to do this, we really have to take a look at what happens right after the Civil War with the rise of what is known as capitalism. So we've all heard the term at some point or another, capitalism being the idea of free markets in which businesses and individuals compete against each other. In the late 1800s, the leaders of the capitalist markets were competing against each other, and they began to monopolize the markets. The markets were kind of out of control, and so they began providing what is called managerial control. There were three methods, generally speaking, that did this. One was called vertical integration. This is where Andrew Carnegie, who's really the best example of this, bought up all the materials and processes that you would use to create his product, and in his case, the product was steel. Another type of managerial process was horizontal integration. John Rockefeller is really good as an example about this. He worked in the oil industry and he basically bought up all his oil competitors, and that way he controlled the market. Last up, probably the most powerful, was J.P. Morgan. Morgan worked within the banking industry and he did something called interlocking directorates. Very complicated term, but here's all it means. Interlocking directorates basically meant that he would put his managers on the trustees or the board of every single bank. He would then loan out money to these banks. They would have to have these people on their boards because of that. And then he could control the decision making within the banking system. Now, the capitalism had a lot of benefits to it, but at the same time, there were some major problems that arose during this time period that led to significant reform movements amongst workers. For example, one of the problems had to do with railroads and pricing. Farmers started noticing that pricing was varied within different areas, and in some cases, pricing to them didn't really make a whole lot of sense. For example, long hauls across the entire country tended to be less expensive. Short hauls tended to be very expensive, which made no sense to them as to why this is the case. We kind of know today why this was the case. There were more railroad systems that were nationwide, and so the competition led to lower pricing. There were fewer of the railroads within shorter areas, and so that's why pricing was higher. Farmers started to form what was called the Grange movement, with the idea that they would try to regulate railroads at the local level to make sure that there was standardization and that there was some way where they would know what pricing was. There would be no kind of corruption or favoritism by the railroads towards local government. Out of this movement came another farming movement called the Populists. The Populists tried to establish bimetallism, or the use of both gold and silver for currency. They were attempting to inflate the currency. Now, why would you want to do that? Inflation sounds really bad, right? The reason why was that farmers realized that, while inflation might cause prices to go up, it also allows people to buy their products more. And the problem for farmers at this time was that not enough people were buying their products. Out of all this eventually became what was known as the Progressive Movement, which was a movement that tried to break down a lot of these monopolies so that there could be more competition. And they tried to do this through government regulation. Eventually, workers faced a number of different problems. They faced problems of being overworked in the amount of hours they were working. In fact, the typical working day was about a 16 to 19-hour working day. Workers worked basically 6 days a week. Some workers worked even more in order to make money. And workers tended to live in situations and work in situations that were very unsafe. And so they formed unions in order to bargain with owners in order to get better wages and better working conditions. Now, eventually, amongst all these reform movements, at the same time, America went through major international changes as well. And the first place that this happened was World War I. The European countries at the time were competing for colonies in places like Africa, Asia, and the Baltics. This eventually led to a series of alliances and buildup of militaries that almost basically destroyed Europe. The U.S. at first wanted to stay out of the war, but eventually got involved when Germany expanded their U-boat, or what we now know today as sort of a primitive submarine type of warfare. What's really important about World War I is what happened at the end, though. The president at the time was Woodrow Wilson. Wilson called for what's known as Wilsonian idealism, or what he also called the 14 points, in which he attempted to assert American leadership in order to solve a lot of these problems that had led up to World War I. Now, the reason why this is so important was that before World War I, America was kind of a second-rate country. Remember, at the beginning of this lecture, we started off with the Civil War, where America had been torn apart. Nobody even knew if America was going to survive. Now we hit hit World War I, and all of a sudden now we start to see America becoming an international leader in setting policy after this global war. Now, in between World War I and World War II, we're going to have two massive changes to America. One is the Roaring Twenties. During the 20s, the reason why it got its name was that America experienced a massive economic boom. This was largely due to new technologies, very typical for capitalism. We're going to see over and over again in capitalism that there is basically a spike in technologies, in this case, the refrigerator, radio, car, plane, and movies. And this led to more wealth and more of an ability to buy things in America. Americans began moving from urban areas into suburban areas. And Americans now had more money in which they could invest. And one of the ways they did this was to speculate onto the stock market. But eventually, by the end of the 1920s, that caused a massive collapse in the stock market, which would affect the rest of the market. And that started in 1928. The Great Depression itself did not really start up until about 1930, but then lasted for that entire decade from 1930 to 1940. This meant that the government started to become more involved in trying to solve these economic problems. So at the time, the president was Franklin Roosevelt, and he argued for a new role for government. He wanted what he called the New Deal, in which the government would come in and act basically as an investor, as somebody who was a non-profit investor, meaning that the government would come in, and since it didn't have to make a profit, could invest in the economy and stimulate the economy by putting cash directly into the workers' hands. His hope was that by doing this, workers would go out and spend more money or create what is known as consumer power. What's important, though, about this is that we see a movement towards a new definition of government. Government's role now became seen as the need for an expanded government in order to get involved in the economy and try and boost the economy. This was different from the late 1800s time period in which the government was seen as what's called laissez-faire, or the ability to be limited. We also see during this time period a change in government due to international changes. World War II, which was seen at the time as being caused by the Great Depression. The Great Depression collapsed the major economies of the world. People began to look for alternatives to democracy and capitalism, and the two big alternatives that arose were fascism and communism. Most Europeans at the time ended up choosing fascism over communism. They saw communism as an atheistic philosophy that did not sit well with their traditions. And so because of that, they turned to fascism, and they turned initially to Adolf Hitler's rise and expansion. But eventually, as we know, America defeats Adolf Hitler. And when America did that and then dropped atomic bombs to end the war in the Pacific theater, that then helped America to rise not just to the power it had after World War I, but now to a dominant world power that we have never looked back from since then. America, for a brief period of time had a monopoly on atomic bombs and would also determine economic policy for the world as well. And that leads us into the next big conflict that's going to stretch from 1945 all the way to 1991, and that is the Cold War. Here, the United States and the Soviet Union possessed what was known as the bipolar world, in which both the US and the Soviet Union competed against each other. But we now know, in looking back at things, that the Soviet Union really never competed with the US. The Soviet Union just was never of the same power that the United States was. So the reason why this is so important is that the United States became a dominant leader in the world, and even though it did have a competitor with the Soviet Union around the world, it really was going to rise to a power that it had never seen before. The competitor, the Soviet Union, did pose a threat, though, and the threat was the expansion of communism. And part of the reason why we end up calling it a Cold War is that the Soviet Union eventually got hold of its own atomic bombs. And at that point, the United States and the Soviet Union were constantly in a fight over building up atomic bombs, but then trying not to make sure we didn't use it against each other to destroy the world. So instead, what we would do is we would fight each other through our proxies, or through countries around the world that we saw as going towards one camp or towards the other. During this time period, though, I would argue, and I'm going to make a big argument in this class, that what really defined U.S. leadership was not our military policy, it was not our nuclear policy, it was rather our economic leadership. And the reason why was what we did right after World War II. It's actually something most Americans don't know about. At the end of World War II, the major leaders of the world, so America led this, but it was also with Great Britain, it was also with France. They met in Bretton Woods in Vermont. Now, why would you meet in a place like Vermont in order to have an international committee meet? Well, the reason why was that America had now become the power of the world. And in Bretton Woods, the United States sat down with their representatives, and they created two major institutions in the world, the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. The IMF, or the International Monetary Fund, provides rules for international capitalism. Countries are told they have to operate in a particular way. The World Bank then provides loans to these countries in order to have them develop. And the global currency at that time period was then tied to the US dollar, which was then tied to US gold deposits. Now notice what's happening here that I think is so important. The United States now is becoming a leader, not just in nuclear policy, not just in military policy, but in economic policy. I'm going to argue that that's the most important development really after World War II, because economic policy is going to determine trade, industrial development, and who really is going to control in the long term what human beings do most often, and that is trade goods and services with one another. And this led into then the golden age of US capitalism. So for most historians looking back on our time period from 1950 to 1970, the U.S. was the predominant economic leader in the world. Internally, the U.S. experiences a massive economic boom, which included as well a massive amount of suburbanization. And that's really a good sign. When people move from farming areas in the cities, that shows economic growth because you have much more industrialization. But when people move from urban areas into suburban areas, what is so powerful about that is that means that people have more money to spend basically on leisure goods. And that means your economy is really taking off. And the U.S. did. At that time period, the U.S. had a strong GDP growth. Our typical annual GDP growth was between what's known as 3 to 4%, which I know sounds like, what's the big deal? 3 to 4% does not sound like that big of a deal. But keep in mind that today we actually do have a slow GDP growth, and it's about at 1, maybe 2%. So 3 to 4% on a regular basis is actually really strong. A good example of this was a strong development in what was known as the Interstate Highway Act. This was during the Eisenhower era, in which investments were put in to build a highway across the country. Originally, that was done for military purposes, but it quickly became a way to build up basically national trade from state to state. So it was a good example of how American capitalism was growing during this time period. However, during this time period, there was also an underground questioning that was taking place of our identity. And the reason for this had to initially do with the Civil Rights Movement, in which Martin Luther King Jr. questioned American racial justice. But then in the 1960s, the women's rights movement arose, the first being Betty Friedan, who wrote a book called The Feminine Mystique, in which she criticized women being forced into remaining in the domestic sphere. So all of a sudden now, the question of roles within society were being challenged, and also the question of gender itself. Was there a difference between men and women, and what was that significant difference? These movements eventually really led to the questioning of a variety of rights for other groups, including rights for different minority groups like Latinos and Asian Americans, also for immigrants, also for gay rights groups as well. And we can see today how we are continuing the fight of that question about how inclusive are we, and what does it mean to say that other groups have rights. Of course, one of the biggest questionings that came up was the Vietnam War itself, and this really challenged, for the first time since World War II, challenged American foreign policy. In 1964, the United States had already been involved in Vietnam, but it got much more heavily involved in Vietnam after American ships were supposedly attacked at the Gulf of Tonkin. The American presence was escalated to 500,000 troops, but by 1969, Americans really questioned that presence, and that it was due to the perception of a supposed loss at what was known as the Tet Offensive, in which the North Vietnamese were able to get down all the way to Saigon and attack the American embassy. Now, it's actually a little bit more complicated than that, and we'll study about that later on in the year. But I think what's important right now to remember is that Americans really questioned whether or not it was possible for us to change the direction of other countries. America also found out after this, through what's called the Pentagon Papers, that the government actually lied about the Gulf of Tonkin, that it was not as simple as us being attacked and needing to get involved in the war. So this led to a whole bunch of questioning, but I think we know one of the questionings that we have to remember too is new conservatism. So in the 1950s, there had been an argument made that after Franklin Roosevelt, that this was really a period, not only the golden period of America, but the golden period of modern liberalism, and that conservatism was really on its deathbed. Well, that was absolutely proven to be false. After 1945, there was a man who was not here from America. He actually made his arguments in Austria. His name was Friedrich Hayek. Hayek questioned the rise of not only socialism, but also the welfare state. He said, America's welfare state may not be socialist, but it keeps enacting policies that eventually get it into a creeping socialist movement. Eventually it will become socialist. And off of his writings and other people's writings, a man named Barry Goldwater, who was a senator in Arizona, ran for president in 1964 for a new group of political thinkers and political activists called the Libertarians, who argued really that government needed to be made as minimal as possible, The only role really that a true libertarian sees for federal government is for military and police powers, and there are some libertarians who would argue that even that ought to be done by the private sector. Conservatives, after his loss, saw that there was a need to rebuild their movement, and so they started to build up an alternative media. Now, this is not the things you've heard about recently, known as the alt-right, or that kind of media. But they did start to build up sort of a base of magazines and newspapers and other types of media, eventually talk shows on radio as well, to try and get conservatives organized around their ideas and beliefs in order to eventually have somebody like a Barry Goldwater win in the government. The best example of this is a man named William Buckley, who founded the National Review. Well, eventually the conservatives were able to defeat modern-day liberalism, and that had to do largely with the economic crisis in the 1970s known as stagflation. In 1973, both unemployment and inflation rose at the same time. There are a lot of reasons for this, but the two biggest ones are oil shocks from a collective called OPEC, or the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, who stopped exporting as much oil, and that raised prices. Also, there was a rising expectations from workers about wages. So what ended up happening was we started seeing inflation and unemployment going up at the very same time, and the traditional ways of trying to control for this, like wage and price controls, just failed. And so there was a questioning of the economic policies coming out of Franklin Roosevelt, and his philosophy is known as Keynesian philosophy. That became questioned during the 1970s. That allowed the 1980s for new conservatism to finally win. So while there was a huge loss for Barry Goldwater in the 1960s, by 1980, Ronald Reagan, who everybody predicted, there was just no way that Ronald Reagan, he was just too extreme, there's no way he was going to win. In fact, even within the Republican Party, they had rejected him in 1976 as a nominee for their party. But in 1980, he was chosen and seen as way too extreme against Jimmy Carter, but he ended up winning the election. And when he won that election, he promoted a new conservatism that in many ways takes us all the way back to capitalism in the late 1800s, and that is supply-side economics. The idea of supply-side economics is that you reduce taxes and regulations, and by doing that, that frees up business to have more money for investment. The argument behind this was eventually what businesses are going to do is they're going to take that money and they are going to invest in their workers and jobs. Why? Because they're nice people? No. Are they greedy? Not really. They're self-interested. Basically, the owners of companies want to make money. That's why you go into business. Well, what's the best way to make money? Create more supply. And that way you can sell it to people. Well, owners don't create more supply. They can't. They don't have the time to do that. They need to manage their business. So what do they end up doing? They hire workers to do this type of thing. So the idea behind this argument was we actually end up creating more jobs by having less taxes. Oh, but wait a second. According to this argument, we also get more taxes. Well, that's kind of weird. How do you get more taxes if you lower taxes? Well, because if we lower the tax rate, according to this argument, you create more economic growth. And by creating more economic growth, even though tax rates are low, you collect more taxes from the economic growth. So from 1983 to 1987, we actually saw this. We saw a dramatic economic growth that took place during this time period. However, one of the big questions that we are going through today is whether or not this type of economic growth was really sustainable, and did it create its own problem of economic inequality? So in the 1990s, along comes Bill Clinton, and Clinton had criticized the Reagan era for soaring debts and economic inequality. When Reagan came into office, we had an $800 billion federal debt. By the time he left office, we had a $3 trillion debt. Bill Clinton criticized Reagan for this and said that a slight raise in taxes was necessary. However, what was interesting about Bill Clinton was Reagan had been so popular that Clinton had to adopt some of Reagan's ideas. And so Clinton created what's called the third way politics, in which he incorporated some of Reagan's ideas into liberal ideas in the hopes of rebuilding the Democrats, rebuilding liberals, but including some of the successful Reagan ideas in doing so. So like, for example, one of the things Bill Clinton did was to try to create more capitalist trade by lowering taxes, lowering tariffs between countries. He created international treaties to do this. For example, NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, which was an agreement between America, Mexico, and Canada to lower tariffs to increase regional trade. He also took part in what is known as the WTO, or World Trade Organization. This is an international court where countries join, and if any country raises its tariffs, they can actually sue one another for raising their tariffs too much. Now, eventually, after this, George Bush came into power, and there are a lot of things about the Bush presidency that are very important, but I think the most important thing for us to remember is what happened internationally, and of course, that has to do with the 9/11 attacks that took place on the World Trade Center. Bush ran for office basically wanting to restore dignity to the U.S. presidency after the scandals that had taken place with the Clinton administration. But what really changed his administration was 9/11. After the 9/11 attacks that took place against the World Trade Center and this new rise of this new type of international group known as Al-Qaeda, President Bush made an argument for a new type of policy, a preemptive doctrine, in which he made the argument that it was necessary to go after countries that supported terrorism before terrorists could actually make a move on us. And one of the classic examples of that was when he intervened in Iraq in order to stop what he claimed was Iraq's attempt to build up WMD, or weapons of mass destruction. Of course, now we know there were no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, and right after this, American forces became stuck basically in a civil war between the two Islamic sects that were in Iraq, the Sunni minority and the Shiite majority. But what really defines the end of the Bush administration, of course, is the 2008 economic collapse, which was a massive economic collapse that took place internationally. It was based upon a new type of trade called the derivatives market. The derivatives market, basically all derivatives mean is that you add value to something. In this particular case, the way you would add value is banks would go out and they sold loans that they had made for housing to the stock market. These were then insured by insurance companies, and that way if you lost money on any individual type of loan, insurance monies would pick you up on that. The problem was the way that they did these loans were so toxic, or so the people they gave it to couldn't pay it back, that numbers, like basically hundreds of thousands of people started forfeiting their ability to pay back their loans on their houses. And when that took place, housing prices themselves plummeted because you had more and more houses going on the market. Once that took place, insurance companies just could not keep up with all the negative profits that were coming in, all the losses that were coming in. So in 2008, all of a sudden, we saw a global freeze took place on banks due to the fears of toxic loans. That then led to the Obama presidency. When Obama came into office, he really saw himself as a possible transformative figure, something like a Ronald Reagan, but on the liberal side. He hoped that he could get America extracted from the problems of the Middle East, turn us towards trade in Asia, solve our global economic contraction, and kind of resurrect economic Keynesianism. In the midst of this economic collapse, he really hoped that he could turn towards a new type of Keynesianism, which the government would get involved. And this became a fight then between Reagan's ideas, supply-side economics, and Obamonomics, which is in many ways a return back to the Keynesian ideas. So 20th century summary then, in trying to look at all this. So the 20th century really has challenged the American identity. You know, what are we? Are we a laissez-faire country, or are we a country of government intervention? We also are going through a massive challenge on our social identity. What does it mean to be American? You know, is America a fight about integration, that we basically tolerate and we respect one another, but we do expect that there are differences between us? Or do we celebrate our differences? Are we multicultural? And what does it mean to say that we are multicultural? Internationally, we are still a leader, but we are being challenged today by a lot of different ethnic national movements. And even as of recently, I would say we are being challenged now by other governments and other countries that are rising in power. Countries that are either rising because of political movements, like in the case of Russia, or economic movements, such as in the case of China and India. So this has left us now with a number of big questions about what exactly does it mean to be an American.